Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Desi, and today I wanted to mix things up a bit and talk about one of my favorite fantasy series of all time, that is A Song of Ice and Fire. I have reread the series twice now. I'm on my third reread, and something that's always kind of piqued my interest is what the climate is like. Because we know that beyond the wall it's very cold. Below the wall in Winterfell it's kind of a cool climate with summer snows, and of course you have Dorne at the bottom with very hot climates. And I really wanted to quantify this. I'm actually a huge weather nerd, and I thought this would be a good opportunity for me to just kind of go off on beautiful, wonderful tangents about what I think the real world counterparts for each individual area are. I've had a lot of theories in the past, and this is an opportunity to put those theories into practice. The first thing I want to do for reference is talk about the parallels. Now, the 45th parallel and the 30th parallel, I believe, dissect Westeros. This map was done by somebody else, and they actually put an equator just south of Dorne. I actually think that's a bit inaccurate. I actually moved the equator down a bit because the jungle continent of Sorthorios, I think is what it's called. If it was that far from the equator, it would have a different climate, so I'm liberally moving the equator south, and I'm putting the 30th parallel right through Dorne and the 45th, basically right through the neck and northern Vale of Arryn. And the Arctic Circle, I believe, the person who put it there, that's fairly accurate. That's above the Haunted Forest and in the lands of Always Winter. So just for real-world comparisons, the 30th parallel goes through the northern Sahara Desert, northern Africa, and basically the boundary of the southern United States and Mexico. And I put it right through the middle of Dorne, so I think that's pretty accurate, because a lot of Dorne is desert, or desert-like climate. And the 45th and the 30th, just for a better map reference, the 45th is important because above the 45th you're in generally a colder, cooler climate with a lot of winter snow. In Europe, this goes through basically the middle of France, northern Italy, Croatia, Romania, southern Russia. In the United States, it goes through the Midwest, southern Montana, and between Washington State and northern Oregon. Now, I do want to point out that the climate in the Midwest gets very cold, especially on this 45th North Dakota-South Dakota line, and that's because you don't have the influence of the ocean. Whereas, like the United Kingdom, they don't even get a lot of snow there in the wintertime. In Europe, kind of the same thing, and that's because of this warm oceanic current that comes from the Atlantic, and that keeps this area relatively temperate and mild, where you don't have that over here. Like, you compare London to like Halifax or Nova Scotia, or even to like Edmonton, Alberta, it's a drastically different climate. Very cold. First thing I want to talk about is the north and beyond the wall. We'll start north and head south. We have, of course, Winterfell, the Dreadfort, Bear Island, the Haunted Forest, and the Land of Always Winter. For the Lands of Always Winter, I'm going to keep this one very brief and succinct. This is an ice cap. There's not much more to say about it. It doesn't get above freezing, and you have probably advancing ice. Now, for terms of real-life climate points, I just picked places in northern Greenland and on the tip of Antarctica. So, there you have it. It doesn't get much above freezing, and when it does, it's in the middle of summer, and most of the time it's below freezing and absolutely frigid and relatively dry. Now, the Haunted Forest and the Frostfangs. This picture is from Banff National Park in Canada. I thought it was a really good representation of both high mountains and thick boreal forest. And the two places that I picked for reference are Nome, Alaska, which is this first one, and Archangelsk, Russia. And I think these are fairly good representations. In Nome, it's very cold in the wintertime, and it's still pretty cool in the summer. In Archangelsk, it's a little bit warmer in the summer, but both of these places have bitter winters. You do not want to be here in wintertime, and that is probably, among other things, why the wildlings want to move south, because the winters are just awful. You can't survive in this, especially if it gets to 48 below or 50 degrees below zero. And this is an especially cold winter coming up in the books, so there you go. Bear Island and Skagos. For Bear Island, I've always seen it as Kodiak Island. You have the mountains, and you have the thick forest, and of course you have the big bears. And for this one, I just picked Kodiak Island. It's in the Gulf of Alaska, south of Anchorage. It's actually relatively low latitude-wise, but I think that's a fair representation, because Bear Island isn't known as a particularly cold place. I just see it as like a cool place with really wet weather and cold winters, obviously, but not exceptionally cold like the other areas. So, 2 places I picked. I picked Kodiak itself. It's a city on the island, Kodiak Airport. As one can see, very wet, very cool, but not exceptionally cold, not bitterly cold, so I think that that's fair. And now for the north itself. The north is huge. So there's 2 places I wanted to talk about especially, and that is the northern mountains and of course Winterfell itself. Now remember, I drew the 45th parallel right about the neck. You know, a little bit south of Moat Cailin. So for the northern mountains, it's described as a land of lakes and mountains and forest. I once again use Banff National Park in Alberta. It's actually BC and Alberta right in the border. And here's a map of where Banff is. It's next to Calgary. I'll be talking about Calgary in a bit because we'll be talking about Winterfell. But Banff is very high up, very alpine climate. It does get decently warm during the summer, but not too warm. The thing about these inland areas, and Banff is very inland, is that in the summertime you can get these really warm systems, and because they get so much sunlight in the summertime, it can get very hot, but this is very rare. Most of the time, you're lucky to have a day above 70 degrees in Banff, but occasionally you have the exceptionally warm day, and that has to do with these microclimate fluke situations. Like, I can't believe it got to 100 in Banff. That's almost impossible to believe, but if you get the right winds and the right conditions, I can see it happening. So, as one can see, fairly wet climate. Well, actually, it's not that wet. It's actually fairly dry. And it's a mountainous region, so very cold nights and pretty much snow all year round. So, Winterfell itself, I do want to point out that Winterfell gets summer snows. That's happened at the beginning of the book. And in terms of timeline, I know the climates in A Song of Ice and Fire are very different than they are in the real world. So I want to make a point of emphasis on that. And at the beginning of the books, I'm going to assume is about September. So anywhere with September snow is a viable location for Winterfell. But among other things, it needs to be away from the coast because Winterfell's inland. And I think that the best place I could think of was Calgary. It's actually right next to Banff National Park, so geographically wise, it's fairly accurate. And here's the climate of Calgary, Alberta. Now, Calgary gets extremely cold in the wintertime, which Winterfell does. It has summer snows. This stupid bar that I made got wrecked when I readjusted it, but that's okay. It's not a very wet place, so to speak, but they do get a lot of snow. It can get very, very cold in the wintertime, and it can get pretty warm in the summertime. Actually get in the low to mid 70s in the summertime. So I think that that's fairly accurate for Winterfell. Another place I picked was Moscow. Moscow doesn't have the same kind of weather extremes. It doesn't get these weird microclimates in the summer. Alberta's weird because they get these things called these snow eater Chinook winds or whatever, where you get winds that come over the mountains and it can get super warm. I don't think that would happen in Winterfell, so I picked Moscow there. So maybe somewhere between Moscow and Calgary would be a good real-world point for the climate of Winterfell. So now we're below the 45th. I did mention earlier that the 45th is important. The 45th parallel marks kind of a climate shift. Below the 45th, you really only get snow in the winter. You don't get those summer snows and those fluke events, and it's generally more temperate climate. But first place I wanted to get out of the way was the Eerie, because the Eerie is kind of an anomaly and an exception. That's because it's so high up in the mountains. It's literally on top of a mountain, the castle itself. And this one was a bit tricky, but I found a resort town in Switzerland called Davos. And here's a picture of it above, and here's the climate stats below. Beginning of the books were between like September and October. It's pretty chilly, and when Tyrion was there, it's mentioned that it's chilly with very cold night temperatures. This is a fairly wet place, and they can get snow pretty much all year round, which is understandable because the Eerie is so high up. By the time of A Feast for Crows, we're in November, December, we're getting a ton of snow up there. In fact, so much that they have to leave, and I think this winter resort town is about as good as it gets in terms of climate points. took me a while to find this, but I think this is a good one. And it's also in Europe too. Now, the Vale of Arryn. And I just want to point out that this artwork is beautiful, so shout out to Ted Nasmith, however you pronounce it. This is absolutely stunning. I think this is my favorite Song of Ice and Fire art that I've seen. So the Vale of Arryn is a valley between the mountains. This is where the crops are grown in the Vale. So it is a temperate region. It is also below the 45th. So what did I pick for this? I picked the Willamette Valley in Oregon. And the Willamette Valley is south of Washington State. It's in the western United States. It is an area surrounded by two mountain ranges. The Cascades on one side, and the background is Mount Hood, that is a old volcano. And on the other side is the Coast Range, which is a smaller mountain range. And it's also not too far from the coast, which is relatively canon compared to Vale of Arryn, because the Vale of Arryn is near the coast as well. So here's a map of the Willamette Valley starting at Portland and descending all the way down to Eugene. You have the Cascades on one side and the Coast Range on the other. So there you go. In terms of climate, initially I wanted to pick Portland because that was the natural choice, but the problem is Portland is a little bit too warm for my liking. Portland also does not get snow until December. I know they have snow in November, but it's exceptionally rare, so it's not even marked. Portland has weird microclimates too. So I instead went a little bit further east to Hood River. It can also get a little bit colder, and they also get November and October snows. That's important to note. That's what's happening in Song of Ice and Fire. I do want to point out the end of A Feast for Crows. It is autumn. And near the Twins, it is actually snowing. It is light snow. It is not sticking. It is melting in the morning. So in the epilogue where Merritt Frey meets his demise, it actually snowed that morning. And this is in autumn, so we can assume it's in November. So the reason why I'm making a point out of this is because the Vale of Arryn is actually a bit north of where the Twins is, or actually about even. So we need to assume that wherever the Vale of Arryn is, they get snow in the late fall, early winter. So two places I picked is Hood River and Zurich, of course, because I wanted to include somewhere in Europe. Relatively similar climates. So the Iron Islands, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on because this is not a very interesting area for me. There's a couple of maps. Here's George's map, and here's one that somebody drew. Of note, of course, is Pike. I think this is a really good picture. The Iron Islands are a windswept, wet, stormy area. Not a lot grows there because of all the wind. So naturally, I picked Astoria, Oregon. Now, this is what they show on the tourist cards. This is to get people to come. But if you look at the coastline, you don't see a lot of houses along here. For one, it's very windy here, and for two, this is what the weather is actually like. This is basically the same picture. This is why not a lot of people live on the Washington and Oregon coast, or even Northern California, because it is stormy and it is very wet. So in terms of places, so I picked for Pike, I picked Forks, Washington, and Astoria. Forks, of course, is where Twilight was filmed, so if there's the one or two Twilight people, I see you. And Astoria is near the 45th parallel, which basically the 45th is very near to where the Iron Islands are. But very similar climates. Forks is actually quite a bit wetter, and Forks is a little bit more inland, so I think Astoria is actually closer in terms of climate. So there you go. Now the Riverlands. I made a point to make a note of Fair Market. At the end of A Feast for Crows, when Merritt Frey meets his demise, like I said before, it snowed that morning. So we need to look for a climate where it can actually snow in late fall, early winter. And of note, here's the Vale of Arryn up here. We're south of the Vale of Arryn. So for River Run, here's another nice piece of art. This one's pretty simple. For some reason, when I think of River Run, I think of Paris, France. Because it has a river that has a CNA or whatever that river is called that goes through it. In terms of snow, it does snow in November, so it's valid there. Quite pleasant in the summer, pretty warm. Actually pretty warm overall. Not a bad place to live. I've never been to Paris. I've been to France, but I haven't been to Paris, so. The Westerlands, not particularly interesting to me either. It does have mountains, there's lots of mining, it's rich in gold and resources. And for some reason, for Lannisport and Casterly Rock in its location, I just think of Seattle. I know it's a bit south of the 45th and Seattle's a bit north, but Seattle's also fairly temperate. And of note, Seattle gets November snow, although it doesn't snow a lot in Seattle. So Seattle's weird. When it does snow, they can get like a foot of it sometimes. Seattle can get a lot of snow. Like the stars have to align for it to snow in Seattle because of the oceanic maritime influence that tends to keep things a bit warmer. This is actually facing west. Those are the Olympics, and this is Puget Sound. The Olympics get a ton of snow, and we can assume the mountains around Castle Rock and Landisport get a fair amount of snow as well. So the Crownlands, actually I believe, is the smallest realm, and we don't know a whole lot about it. We know a bit about Dragonstone, we know a bit about Duskendale, we know a little about Rosby, but the focus is King's Landing, where a huge chunk of the books are based in. We have the 3 roads, all roads lead to Rome, all roads lead to King's Landing. Here's a picture of King's Landing, and for climate, I thought about it for a while. I ended up going with Washington, D.C., because of how warm it's described at the beginning of the books. When Eddard Stark comes to King's Landing at the beginning of the book, it is hot. And Robert describes the women and like how hot it is in the summertime. You know, people are going into the river and getting wet because it's hot. And Washington, D.C. does have a very hot, sweltering summer. I use Baltimore also because it's a little bit closer to the coast. So I think that this is a fairly good representation of the weather in King's Landing. So I do want to point out as well that although it gets hot in the summer, it also snows in the winter. So make note of that here. At the end of A Feast for Crows / A Dance with Dragons, it is snowing in King's Landing and sticking. And that's what happens in Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. They can get notoriously bad snowstorms, so I think this is pretty accurate. So now we're entering the Southern Realms. And this one has been pretty straightforward, except for one. Remember, I put the 30th latitude in the middle of Dorne, essentially. That, in our real world, goes through the northern Sahara and basically the southern tip of the United States. So the anomaly here is Storm's End. This took me a long time to find a real-life comparison. Storm's End, based on what I've seen and how it's described, there's not a whole lot of scenes in Storm's End, but I can just assume that it is a windy, stormy, rainy place, but it is also south of King's Landing, so the climate needs to be accurate. And I ended up going to New Zealand. New Zealand might be a little bit further south, but this took me forever and ever to find an accurate representation. And I'm going to assume that it could snow in Storm's End in winter as well. The place I picked was called Milford Sound. And here's a picture of it. This is actually on a very nice day. But if you look, you can almost feel the moisture in the air. This is an extremely wet, stormy location. It's in the Fiordlands National Park in New Zealand. And here's the climate stats. This is one of the wettest places on Earth. I don't think Storm's End is one of the wettest places on Earth, but I do believe Storm's End is very wet. Maybe not half as wet as this place, but I think the climate stats are fairly accurate. They don't get a whole lot of snow. Most of the snow is confined to the mountains, but the temperature, remember, this is south of the equator, so this is a different seasonal. So January is their summer, July is their winter. It gets pretty chilly in the winter. It can get, in the 20s. It can get below 0 Celsius centigrade. So they do get snow there, but it's very rare. Now the Reach. Thank you for providing this beautiful artwork. This shows all the houses. So credit where it's due. The Reach is a agricultural wonderland. This is where the majority of crops and grains and livestock come from the Seven Kingdoms. It is the most populated kingdom, and of note is Oldtown and Highgarden. So for Highgarden itself, this is a lush capital. This is one of the more appealing places to be in the Seven Kingdoms. They have long growing seasons. It gets hot in the summer, and they have a fair amount of rainfall, otherwise you wouldn't have this lush sort of land surrounding Highgarden. It can be assumed, based on the Duncan Egg Tales, they do have droughts. It's very hot and very dry in the summertime, but they have a big river, the Mander, that goes right through the middle of it, so they probably have irrigation practices. Now for Highgarden itself, the first place I picked was Redding, California. It is in the northern San Bernardino Valley. Redding gets very hot during the summer, but it can also get quite chilly in the wintertime and even snow occasionally. And here's the climate stats. Snowfall's rare, but it happens. It's fairly wet, but dry in the summer, which we know that Highgarden can be dry in the summer because of the Duncan Egg books. If If you remember when Dunk and Egg were at that castle, and for serving that minor lord, they had that one little keep. There was a drought that was ongoing at that time. And Reading is in California, and California is drought prone, so I think Reading is fairly good. The other place I picked was Atlanta. I really like this picture of Atlanta. I've never been to Atlanta, but Atlanta is warm and wet, and there is good farmland in the Georgia area. So I thought I'd include it as well. Atlanta is a little bit more balanced. So I think if you kind of balance between Atlanta and Reading, you have a fairly good indicator of what Highgarden is like. Atlanta also gets snow. And you know what? I believe if the Song of Ice and Fire ever gets finished, that's me knocking on wood, that it will snow in Highgarden. Mark my words. Now we have Old Town. This one I thought a lot about. I kind of see Old Town as like a touristy area, despite it being it's a destination location. So I ended up going with Palermo, Italy. This is the southern tip of Sicily. Also, Old Town is very far south. It's actually even with the northern parts of Dorne. So I think Sicily is fairly good. And here's the climate stats for Palermo. It can get very hot. It's actually a little bit drier than I would like for Old Town. But again, it could be drought prone. It's in the Reach. We know that the parts of the Reach at least are drought prone. So I think that sums it up. Very hot in the summertime, very mild in the winter, and a fair amount of rain. Now for Dorne, which is the most interesting in terms of climate. This is where I think George kind of messed up, because you have the Stormlands, which are known for their storms, but you have Dorne, which is known for being dry, and they're adjacent. And of course you have the Reach, which is known for being lush. Now I get you have a mountain range here, which blocks some of the rain. We don't know the rain shadow or any of that. I don't think George was a meteorologist, and in terms of fantasy building and world building, it's pretty difficult to, think about meteorology and think of what happens with the storms. We don't know a whole lot if there's hurricanes or whatever, but we do know that Dorne is dry. The first part of Dorne that I want to talk about is the Red Mountains and Marshes. For this, I chose the Atlas Mountains in Morocco. As you can see, they get snow on the higher peaks, and it's fairly barren, but there are trees and there is wildlife and there is growth. And in fact, certain parts of the Atlas Mountains are quite lush. So I think that's fairly accurate for the Dornish Marches. Now, a lot of Dorne is just this. This is what I think the average reader thinks of Dorne. It's just red sand dunes. And that's true. There are large parts of Dorne that are just desert. Now, for Sunspear, the capital city, oranges are important. I'm actually right in this chapter in my reread. And there are wild oranges. There are oranges that grow in Sunspear and in that region. This actually allows us to pinpoint locations in the real world that we can directly say this is where Sunspear feasibly is, because wild oranges have to grow there. These are the areas where oranges are cultivated. You have the southern United States, Baja California, southern Texas, and Florida, of course, Cuba, and the Mediterranean. I actually went with Tunisia, which is right here. And why Tunisia? In terms of building design, I think that it's fairly close. When I think of Sunspear, I think of ancient Carthage for some reason. And here's actually the city of Tunis in Tunisia, the capital city. And if you look down at the bottom, you see these old ruins. These are the ruins of ancient Carthage. And this is a recreation of what ancient Carthage looked like. Not a whole lot of people know about ancient Carthage because Rome destroyed it. When the Roman Empire was expanding, Carthage was its first real nemesis. There were 3 wars fought, and in the 3rd war, Carthage was completely destroyed. But this is a recreation. Now, of course, where Carthage is and where Tunis is known for its oranges. So that makes it canon, and they also have a fair amount of moisture. We can look at their climate. It is not terribly dry. It can get very hot during the summer times, and even in the wintertime, it is very warm. Now, in the books, we're about in November. I do think that it could be a little bit warmer because Ariel Hota, the captain of the guards in A Feast for Crows, is mentioning as he's going back to Sunspear that he has to wear very light clothing and has to wrap his helmet because it gets so hot. Maybe it's an exceptionally warm day in November. It can get in the mid-80s in November, but yeah, maybe it's like an 80-degree day and wearing hot armor when it's 80 degrees, but maybe a little bit warmer. But I think this is fairly accurate, and this is a good location to compare it to Sunspear. Anyways, I hope you all enjoyed this presentation. I hope you all enjoyed this new format. This is something I've been wanting to talk about for a while. And it took me a lot of time to research, and I actually had to re-upload and redo the first video because of technical issues and because my voice sounded terrible. So hopefully this version will be better, and I hope you all enjoyed it, and I'll see you on the next one.